Hey, thanks again for sending in questions related to our recent sermons. Well, this last Sunday, not only did we celebrate Easter, we studied Romans 6, which discusses the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And so the question this week asks, how do we know this really happened? How do we know this isn't just a myth or a fairy tale? And one of the benefits of Christianity is how well documented the resurrection is. Much of that evidence comes from our New Testament, but that New Testament isn't just one book. It's many books written by many different authors. And so quickly, some of the credible evidence for the resurrection is that the books of the New Testament were written by eyewitnesses or those who interviewed eyewitnesses, and they were written during the time period while other eyewitnesses were still living. And so it's a way that they could data check, verify what was going on. There's little vignettes in the New Testament of, the name of the person who carried Jesus' cross, where he was from. This is how they cited their sources in ancient literature. The idea was you could go to that town, find that guy, and ask him about it. And it was written during the time period that you could go ask him about it. So it was written as reportage. It was written as a news story. It was not written as a fable. One of the observations is that, of course, there were mythologies in that time period, but that is not how the New Testament was written. It was written as you put a news article, that something has really happened. C.S. Lewis points out, who was a professor of ancient literature. He says, the New Testament, we might see the New Testament as this kind of historical fiction or modern realistic fiction. We have that category. But they didn't have that category then. The fiction of their day wasn't written like the New Testament is written. So C.S. Lewis, who has massive amounts of experience, taught at Oxford on what ancient fiction was, he says that if the New Testament is this kind of modern realistic fiction, then not only did they invent the category, because it had never been done in the history of the world up until that point, not only did they invent the category of modern realistic fiction, then after they did it, it didn't show up again, for another 1,000, 15, 1,800 years, something after the New Testament. It would be this singular piece of modern realistic fiction, exported back to the ancient world. So it's much more likely that it is what it looks like to be, which is reportage. So that's some of the evidence. Another piece of evidence is there's things contained within the New Testament that they would not have included unless it was actually the way that it happened. One of the big examples is the role of women coming as being the first eyewitnesses to the resurrection. The women saw that Jesus rose, and they came back and told the men. And this was unheard of in ancient times. Unfortunately, women's testimony wasn't even admissible evidence in courts. So if you wrote a story that said the women were the first ones to see the resurrection, people would have immediately dismissed it. They would have said, well, of course, that's what women would say. We can't even believe what they say in court. Of course, we wouldn't say that today, but they would say that then. The point is, you wouldn't write the story that way unless it's what actually happened. It would undermine what you're trying to prove. But they wrote it that way because that's the way that it happened. It's a real evidence of the real story. And of course, as you probably know, another piece of evidence of the resurrection is all of Jesus' closest, earliest disciples. They either died or spent their life in exile because they were preaching this message that he was alive. They didn't get fame and glory. They got exiled. They got arrested. They got executed. And you got to think you wouldn't do that if it was some kind of big lie. If I'm holding on to a lie, I'm going to let go of it real quick. If you say if you keep saying that, I'm going to execute you, I'll say, okay, I'll stop saying it. But they didn't stop saying it. None of them did. It's you might think, out of the remaining disciples, maybe one of them would have held on to the lie all the way to the end, but certainly not all of them. And so we can have confidence that what we read in the New Testament is actually true. So we hope that is helpful. It gives you confidence that the New Testament is credible. We'll see you next time.